Okay, so welcome back everybody. Hope the break was fine and good and you enjoyed your coffee. And now we go to our next speaker. It's actually Sebastian. He's he's dev evangelist from Telerik.
Yep.
And yeah, he will talk you and give you an introduction to NativeScript today. And he told me before that he even has a surprise, I guess, towards the end of the talk. So yeah, it'll be pretty exciting, I hope. So yeah.
Cool, thank you
Stage
for
is yours.
So just before I start, how many of you actually know Angular or played with it? Yeah, that's going to be relevant. Good, good. Okay, so actually, yeah, my name is Sebastian Wilatec. I work for Telerik, as I was introduced, and NativeScript is actually one of my favorite technologies that I work with. And it's not just because I get paid to say so, but I actually genuinely believe in it. So let me start explaining like what NativeScript really is. Like very briefly, it's basically a framework that allows you to build mobile apps with JavaScript. And the idea is that with JavaScript, you actually build those apps for iOS and for Android, and we already have a preview for Windows Universal. And the UI that you get out of it is 100% native, right? So you kind of get the best of the two worlds, where on one side you can cover multiple platforms, but at the same time you don't really get much of a performance penalty because what you see is basically the real thing. And usually when I started like, oh yeah, you can use JavaScript and all that, it's like, oh, is it like PhoneGap Cordova? I was like, not exactly. So one of the first things, there is no DOM, right? There is no web view, there is no web browser inside. The whole of it is pretty much all of the UI is native, right? Another thing is like people are like, well, so how about Xamarin? Well, Xamarin, you write all the code in C# and you as well have to write separately for iOS and then for Android, but as well they compile their code. So while in our case, when you have the JavaScript always stays as JavaScript, right? And then finally, if we look at React Native and Titanium Accelerator, the big difference is like we offer you a direct access to the native API from JavaScript. So you don't have to write any wrappers in, let's say, Xcode or in Java. You basically get direct access to all the native APIs, which pretty much means that if there is functionality that you want to, let's say, use, but we didn't expose it for you, you can very easily like just check the documentation and write it yourself, which is pretty awesome. So we've pretty much been working on NativeScript for the last 3 years, and we released the first full release, version 1, in May over a year ago. And the whole thing was that at that point, the whole NativeScript was based on JavaScript only. So you were using JavaScript to build mobile applications. And then we had somebody from the Angular team reaching out to us and said, hey, we are building Angular2, which is going to be platform agnostic and all that. And we would really want NativeScript to be actually the mobile face, or can you make NativeScript to work in Angular2? Right, so we said, well, let's give it a go, right? It's Google calling, so why not? So pretty much from then we set up a team, and Tobias Bosch from the Angular team, who was one of the tech leads, was meeting every Tuesday with Hristo Deshev, who was actually a tech lead, or the person that was assigned as a tech lead for the Angular integration. And from the very, very beginning, they were plotting, how to dominate the world, or at least the mobile space, right? And the thing was like, just very, very first meeting, they went through the architecture of how Angular should look. And by the way, this is a screenshot from even our first, from the document from the first meeting. And we're like straight away going like, okay, so this is platform agnostic. How do we take advantage? What can we do so that we reuse as much of Angular as possible and enforce as little of differences imposed by NativeScript, right? And it was pretty cool because the whole architecture, and this is like by default how Angular works, or Angular 2, where you write all your code, like you have the markup, so that'll be your HTML, and you will have some sort of DOM adapter that would translate markup, compile it, and create those proto-views. And proto-views are basically the elements that drive all the logic. That's where you have all the bindings, that's where you can do all the ng-ifs and ng-fors and all the mechanisms of Angular that sits pretty much there. And this part is pretty much platform agnostic, where Angular 2 splits into different platforms, like when you go web or mobile or desktop or Hoover, right, is actually when you have this platform-specific code where you have to implement specific renderer and then something that manages the visual tree. So we looked at it and it was like, yeah, well, let's give it a go. So for markup, we said, well, we can use HTML. So that's how you can define your UI. We use Parse5 as the DOM adapter. And basically, because Parse5 was already a standard compiler provided by them, we just reused whatever we were getting out of Parse5. So that was the beginning, that was the easy part. Then the slightly harder part was like, okay, so how do I take those proto views and then turn them into NativeScript code, or how do we actually render iOS views or Android views? So basically we had to implement our own NativeScript renderer, which basically was giving you the iOS native view and then Android as well. So basically all that means that if you use Angular2, you can write code like this. Let's say you want to create a login page, right? So you usually start with a model of a user which has email and password. Next thing, you need some sort of service, right? So this service, you create yourself a class, and in a service you have functions like how do I register, or how do I log in, or how do I reset password, this kind of stuff. So now you have service, maybe say, okay, let's put it in a view. So we would start with a component. So in a component you would take and then import the user service that you created. Then you provide it as one of the providers. Then in the constructor you can take that user service and you inject it into your main component. And basically having done that, then I can go and say, okay, I have a login function. So in my login of the view, I could actually go this user service.login and pass in the user object. And then same thing for sign up or registration. And the fun thing is that all the way until here, we don't have anything specific to the mobile or web or any other platform, right? This is very generic. And it's actually the next step that we actually saying, well, let's implement the view. So when it comes to using this and building a website, you just create a bunch of divs, put some labels in there, put some input tags, and then you can capture email password. Then you can have a login button, and then you can have sign up button. And then obviously, if you want to do, let's say, desktop integration of it or mobile, you pretty much do the same thing. So what is it so special about NativeScript, right? Like, why did Google even come to us wanting, say, come and integrate it with Angular2? One of the first things is it's the whole UI approaches. Like you get what's available in the native SDK. So you have access to native animations, or if there's any special effects that you can use all of that. And for most of the UI integrations, you use the GPU of the device, so you can push it and squeeze it as much as you want. The next thing is like you get maximum skill reuse, right? So if you already know Angular, if you're JavaScript expert, if you have all this knowledge, you can just basically sit down and start coding. You can start building applications really, really fast. So this is a huge thing, because then you can start thinking like, okay, I could have a desktop application, or I can have a mobile application or web. And this is a very, very big story for us, actually. The NativeScript and Angular together, it kind of creates a whole new thing. And pretty much Angular2 is a first-class citizen. So it's not something that we went, okay, we're going to hack it in. We actually changed our Angular integration works so that you first think of Angular while you're writing the code, and then you think of NativeScript when you're just basically setting out the UI. Because basically they're so close, tied together, which is really good. And as a result, then you can start thinking, it's like, okay, I can use Angular and NativeScript together to build Android, iOS applications and web applications as well, sharing the code base, which is a pretty huge thing. And then the other thing is, like I mentioned before, you get direct access to the native API. So let's say, like, if you want to create a pop-up directly in iOS, you could literally just call new UI alert view, set message, add a button, call show. And if you were thinking like, well, so how do I know about all those properties? Who's documenting that? I mean, like iOS has so many different functions and objects and everything. I would say, well, it's not us, because basically you just go to iOS documentation and all of that is there. It's just we have a mechanism that allows you to access all those functions and properties directly. And similarly, you can do the same thing with Android. So if you want to create a new time object, you just say new android.text.format.time. And this is the namespace that you would use in Java if you were writing directly Android. And all of that is going to run on JavaScript virtual machine that's included within the application. So how does this work? It's actually quite simple once you know. It took me a while, but basically all of the code runs on JavaScript virtual machine. So for Android, we use Google V8. For iOS and Windows Universal, we use WebKit's JavaScript core. And the whole thing is that, let's say I'm going to give you an Android example. You want to create a new file. And we're going to go through few steps. We have this thing we call the bridge that does the translation from JavaScript to native. So if you want to create a new file, you call new Java IO file, provide a path. And one of the first things is going to happen, we're going to take that path and we're going to translate it from the JavaScript object to the native object. So in this case, we're going to get a Java lang string. The next thing is we're going to go and look up this Java IO file. So we have this thing we call the metadata. And metadata is pretty much the collection of all the available functions and types that exist in a specific SDK that you're working on. So because now I'm working on Android, that metadata will have all the Android functions and types that I work on. So we go to metadata, and we're going to go and find the constructor. So now that we have all the parameters and we have the constructor, what we can do is execute the call dispatcher, which basically gives you like a dual result. So on the native side, which is over here, we get a native file object, native Android file object. And then on the other side, which is the side that we work on, we get a custom proxy object, which basically is linked to the native one, right? So every time now you execute any calls on that file object, it gets delegated to the Android one. And if there's an event that happens on the native object, that event will be delegated up to the JavaScript. And the best thing is that from your perspective, when you run NativeScript, you only ever think of that gray box over there. This just basically happens behind the scene. But that's how it works. So you would probably think like, well, so what about this metadata, right? Like, where does it come from? Like, how do I get it? Like, do I have to download it? How long do I have to wait to update it? And it's a very good question. And the thing is that we have this thing called metadata generating process. And that's actually something that is included as part of the build. And what happens when you want to build, let's say, for the first time against, let's say, Android version 6.0, what will happen is the MGP will go through the SDK, find all the functions and all the types, and we inject it into the metadata library, right? And as well, if you have any third-party libraries, let's say you bought those beautiful iOS calendar controllers and the same thing for Android, and you want to use them, what you have to do is just basically import them into the project, and MGP is just going to do it just like with the SDKs, go through all the functions types and inject them so that you can use them straight away. And this basically means that you have day zero support for any features and functionality that can exist on native platform. Yeah. So like an example could be Apple would release a new feature that allows you to put your phone here, you call teleport, and it arrives there. You want to use it, but you don't want to wait for us to give you a plugin for it? Well, just go check the documentation, write 3 lines, build it, bang, your phone disappeared. Hopefully the screen wouldn't be cracked. That's a different story. So this is the foundation of how NativeScript pretty much works underneath. And you probably think like, well, I really don't want to write Android or iOS code specifically because otherwise what's the point, right? You might as well do it natively. And the good news is that you're not expected actually to write one or the other most of the time, only in rare cases. So what we have is we have this thing like I call the core modules, which is an abstraction layer on top of all of your code. So you normally write your JavaScript code and you use those modules that basically translate to platform-specific code for either for Android or for iOS. Yeah, and the abstraction layer actually works for 2 different things. One, for the UI. So you have one common approach to create UI components. So if you want to have a little switcher, one for Android, one for iOS, you literally just have to say, I want to switch. And when you build the application, we'll give you either Android one or the iOS one. You don't have to worry about it. So that's number one, right? When you define what goes in the UI, you don't have to think of both platforms. Yeah. The next thing is when it comes to functionality. So I showed you how to create a file directly in Android, but I wouldn't advise you to do it that way. The best thing is actually to require a file system module, and then you just go call new file. And then when you run it on Android, you're going to get the call that I was showing you before. But if you run iOS, you get this very verbose interpretation of the same thing. Yeah. So this basically happens behind the scene, but the code above is the code that you think of, which makes it much, much cleaner as well. Because then you can have just JavaScript developers that don't have to think. It's like, well, how is iOS doing it? You just call it. So there's a whole bunch of modules that we built, and then they vary, from a lot of different UI components to backend services to a lot of different stuff that can help you out. Another really good one is HTTP module. So this module is pretty much, if you want to call a web service and you're in JavaScript, the first thing you're going to probably do is say, hey, I want to make an AJAX call. But the thing is that Android or iOS doesn't understand an AJAX call because that's not available natively. So we pretty much created an HTTP module for you so that you just say, well, I want to get JSON providing this URL. And then we're going to spin like a background thread to execute it. And when the whole result is back, we're just going to give you a promise back saying, hey, here's ready, and do something with it, which is pretty cool. Which basically kind of like gives you like a bigger picture, right? Because then if you want to use an HTTP module, what you do is like you have this abstraction layer that basically translates into either native iOS call and native Android call, which then results in something happening in iOS or Android app. But then we can take even a step back when we introduce Angular. And when you introduce Angular, like all of a sudden we can have this bigger HTTP component where if you're building a mobile application, we're going through this route. But when you build a web application, we could actually give you the HTTP component that comes with the browser, which would then execute an AJAX call for you that would do something in a web application. Yeah? So you see, like those services, like I was talking before about like the user service to log in, register, and everything. If that uses an HTTP module, even though that the calls will be very different for iOS, for Android, and for web, Angular wraps it up for you, while we wrap the story around different mobile platforms, which is pretty cool. Basically, all of that means that you get access to all syntax that comes with Angular 2 itself. So you get access to attributes binding, you can do all sort of conditions, you can have condition styling, or pretty much anything that is available in Angular, just like you would do for a website. One more thing that I should probably talk about, if you want to, let's say, style your website and mobile application, we decided to actually use CSS syntax. So this is not exactly CSS, but it's basically something that works in exactly the same style. So why is it this way? It's because basically for every property that you have, be it color, font width, or margin, or a lot of different things, we had to implement something natively that basically tells the native component, say, now your color is red. Yeah. So that means that as much as we can cover quite a lot of them, the properties that we support, they're limited to an extent. So you can actually, if you go to that URL, you can see what of the properties we support. And funny enough, the first time I presented NativeScript, we only had just 3. These were the first 3 ones we had, because it was like a proof of concept, can it work? Yeah. But at the same time, the interesting thing is the whole cascading rules work, right? So if you have app.css, it's going to be global, which can be which you can override by the CSS that is specific to the file, which you can override with something that is inline or directly on the component. And one final thing that you have to always think about, the web UI is not a mobile UI in this case, right? If you wrote before Cordova code, you're always thinking like, well, I can do exactly the same thing in the web as mobile. But the thing is that, for example, there's no such thing as diff. on a mobile application, right? Android doesn't understand div, so you have to switch your mind a little bit, right? You have to think like, okay, what can I do natively on a mobile platform? So in this case, we have different layouts to rearrange your screen. So you have like the absolute layout where you can specify the X and Y coordinates where the component should be. You have dock layout where you can say, oh yeah, I want to put it on the left, this thing put on the bottom, and this put on the top, kind of thing. Grid is pretty much like a table approach. And stack and wrap layout, they're very similar. And stack, by the way, is my favorite one because I'm a designer. So it allows you to actually take one component and just stack them one below the other. And pretty much that's the idea. So I'll take you through a code very quickly, and so that you actually get the idea of how the whole thing works. And hopefully the demo gods are with me. Otherwise, it's going to be fun. All right, let's see. Where are we? Here. Let's make this a bit smaller, maybe. No, let's keep it this way. Can you guys see the code, or should I make it bigger? Yeah, but make it bigger. Right, that should be right. So I just before the presentation, I actually ran the one line of code because I'm using command line to build the applications. So I have it running in a live sync mode. So every time I make changes and save the file, like the application is gonna reload after a short period of time. So I can keep refreshing, right? So if I wanted to, let's say, start playing with Angular and what sort of things are possible. So this example is all about just showing you a little bit of mechanics. So if I wanted the Hello Zurich not to be something that is hard-coded, but maybe something that comes from my component, I could actually just maybe add a message object, say string, hello me. Can save this, and then basically I could change this to a binding message, save this, and then next time we refresh, the message should come directly from the object. Obviously the message is a little bit small. I already have in my style a slightly bigger font, so I could just go set the class to big so that we can all see it a little bit better, and that should work nicely as well. And the thing is that I could very quickly just add other components. Maybe I want a button that does something for me, so I could just say button tap me maybe, and I'm gonna call a function do something, and maybe do something could do say I am doing something, be patient. So at the moment it's not doing anything. When you refresh, it should do it. It should give us like a little pop-up. Cool. So the other thing that you can get in with Angular, you can have conditional styling. So let's say if we had like a property, like a warning Boolean property, let's set it to true by default. Actually, set it to false, and we're gonna use our do something to change it to the opposite. So we have warning equals. If I could type. So that's one part of the story, and then here on the label we can actually do something like this: class.warning, as it was in our CSS style, and we could say warning equals true. I don't have to say equals true, it's just so that it's clear what sort of things you can do in here. Let it refresh. And you can see the styling changes as the Boolean goes to true and false. It's actually pretty simple. I could maybe add additional label maybe that NS label that basically pops up additional message, just to calm you down when the warning is happening. So we could say panic, scream and run, right? Just to calm you down a little bit. And we're gonna call it using ngIf. So we only want to see it visible where warning is, and we're gonna confuse everyone. Say false, because bugs happen even in live demos. So when there's no warning, we keep getting the tag coming in and out, in and out. So these are some of the basic stuff. Like another thing that we can actually do is we have native animations inside NativeScript. So what happens is basically I could create like a bunch of keyframes. So I want to say at the beginning, when you start, I want you to start by scaling my component by just half the size. Then when you get to 40%, scale it up to 130% each element. And then I want you to scale it back down to the original size. So if I have a keyframes animation set up like this, I could then add it to my styling. So whenever I change styling to warning, I could execute this animation. So say I want to call zoom and run it for 2 seconds. So if I save this and reload, now you can see the label just kind of like smoothly zooms in and out. And the really cool thing about these animations is like that it actually is run by the GPU of the device. So you can actually go as crazy as you want. So you have a lot of transformations. You can make it rotate. You can move it from one place to another. You can make it fade in, fade out. You can do a lot of different things. So I'll give you a few examples. And what I did is, you see, rubber band is nowhere here. I cheated last night and I went to this website, and basically there's this library that has a lot of different animations that you can kind of play with in. So I took these animations that are designed just basically for Angular and imported into my project, and most of them just pretty much work. So I have a few of them to show. So we have one that is rubber band. No, I didn't save. That would help. So it kind of like squeezes in and out. The next one is bounce left in left. So this one is quite cool. So it kind of like zips in. Or we have a bounce. Bounce is pretty cool. It's very bouncy. You can take the app for a party and it will bounce for you. Ding, ding, ding. And you can actually, basically what you can do with it is you can get very creative how you, let's say, load a page. Let's say you have a service that when you open, you have to first load some data, which takes 5 seconds. So in order to make it easier for the user to wait for it, you could just kind of, rather than just pop up the screen, you could just fade in nicely, do something before the data arrives, and so that you can, display it on the screen. And then automatically the applications, just feel nicer. Me as a developer, I never care about the visuals, right? Like I just like to write things functional. But when a user gets the app and they want to play with it, like they just want to, be entertained, not just have something that works. Yeah. I mean, it should still work, right? But entertain me at the same time. I'm trying to order a pizza, but make it spin while I'm ordering it. This kind of thing. So the animation is one of the things. Another really cool benefit of NativeScript, we have loads of NPM packages that are built by the community. So yes, we have like a team of 30-something people working on NativeScript, but at the same time, we have quite an active community. So Brad Martin is one of them, and he, for example, created this color picker component. So what you can do is just install the NPM module into the project from command line, which I already did before, just in case Wi-Fi wasn't helpful. And basically, I can start using it within my project. So let me just show you quickly. So if I use, So first thing I have to do, after I import it in the project, I have to import the module, the npm module. I will need as well a color, and let me load ng. And then basically what I have to do is say I need a color picker. So I create an instance of the color picker. I as well set the selected color property. And then I have a function that uses the picker. So basically what I do is say I want to take the picker, show it with some default value, and then when I get the result back, I want to go and update the selected color. Yeah. So then what I can do is actually take our button, and maybe I'm gonna take background color. I hope it's this way, and I'm gonna bind it to selected color. Let's put in a new line. Cool. So by default, this is gray, not particularly pretty, but I missed something, right? Let's see. Do something. Yeah, we should actually call the function. That was easy to fix. There we are. So now I can click on it, and we have actually native color picker popping up. And now I can go change the color a little bit to, let's make this dark greenish thing, and my button doesn't update. All right. That's interesting. Oh, updated now. Let's pretend you didn't see it the first time, okay? I blame Nathan, Brad. There we are. Works now. And the thing is that the same module will work exactly the same on iOS and on Android. So we will have an equivalent to both. So these are kind of like the stuff you can do like at a very, very basic level, right? I mean, this application is not particularly amazing, but these are the stuff you can do. You basically use Angular, and the only thing that you really see here that is NativeScript specific is basically I am using stack layout and a label, and I need to know that, let's say, label has a text property, right? Or that my button has a tab event. But when it comes to all of the syntax, you know, like how you bind to a function, you know, putting brackets around tab, or how you bind to an attribute, you know, putting square brackets, is pure Angular 2. So the learning curve is actually quite small. It's basically what sort of UI components can I use, you know, what are the modules that can help me out, and you know how you set up the whole thing. Cool. So let me show you a little bit better example. So what's the next thing? Let's kill this. Yeah, next example I'll show you on Android, because why not? So the next example is actually coming from our tutorial. So we have an online tutorial that allows you to like build this small groceries app that you know, introduces you to all the main features within NativeScript. So pretty much you could learn most of it that you need to learn within like couple of hours, maybe 3-4 hours, depending how good are you with JavaScript or Angular. And we have two versions of it. One is basically for Angular, one is for JavaScript. So all you have to do is just say, go to nativescript.org when it loads, and there's like a getting started link. You can imagine it. It's just go there and you'll be like getting started just there. Let's see if it's built already. There you go. So my groceries app just built, and the reason why I want to show you is that because I'm not a designer and I want to show you actually applications that look nice. So this one, for example, is a grocery app which allows you to log in, provide a username and password, you sign in, and it takes you to another page. Depending, well, at the moment, in the other page, we're loading some data and then displaying on the screen. Let's see. But it's dependent on how fast can I log the data. There you go. So we getting next screen, loading the data, and you kind of have like a grocery list. And because the actual account we keep sharing with a lot of people, so people apparently want to buy a hash table in a grocery store, right? I mean, I get the milk, but I don't know this language. So maybe we should delete a couple of them or something. Yeah, got rid of it. So let me show how the whole code works for you, because that's as well quite interesting. So in sample groceries, we'll have few things like just very quickly, the login page itself, HTML. You can have even inside text property, you can have conditions. So saying if is logged in true, then print sign in. If it's not, print sign up. If you want to bind to if you want to use two-way bindings like you do in Angular 2, you would use ng model on the text field, and then you bind it directly to user password and things like that. But the really cool thing is, probably that I should talk to you more, is, let's say we look at the user service. So it's just like something I was trying to show you in my slides before, where you have the register user and the login user. And the fun thing is that you can actually reuse that for both mobile and web applications. We also have the way you navigate between pages. We use Angular's routing functionality. So what you do is that in Angular, every component, or every page or every view is actually a component by itself. So what you can do at the beginning when you set up the routing, you can import each of the views, and then you create yourself like a root table. So by default, say I want to start with login component, but then I should have list as one of the pages. And if you have like 20 or 50 pages or something, you just basically set them up, all of them in here as roots. And then you can use Angular's navigation that takes you to a specific page. So let's see. In our login component page, when we go to login, you see we're calling user service to login. And if we are successful, we basically calling this router.navigate, and we just provide the list parameter. So we're using Angular's routing to say, go and give me the component and display it on the page. That was actually one of the challenging things for us to implement from Angular perspective, because with every RC release, they were changing it, which was quite fun. Our developers loved it. They were very challenged. But we have it, like basically the day after Angular 2 was fully released, we had actually full release for NativeScript as well. So we always stayed very close and worked with the team together. The other thing that in the list component itself, I want to show you, we have this grocery list. This is like an array that contains grocery objects. And then in order to display it, we have this list view component. So in the list view component, basically what you do is say, I've got my items that come from the grocery list, and then inside you have a template. So you're pretty much saying for every item in the grocery list, I want to have a grid layout that has a label, and maybe a stack layout inside that has an image. And as well, like on the stack layout, we have like actually on tap function that can call delete item. So it's very straightforward. Like even if you start looking at the code and trying to read it, it's very basic. Very, it's pretty obvious what is it that you're trying to do. One last thing from this example, if we have a look, list component. We have a share functionality. So this is yet another npm module where there is you can download, you can call like install npm from npm social share for NativeScript. And basically what this allows you to do is if I press share here, if you have WhatsApp or Facebook or anything here, you could actually say, okay, I want to go and message somebody. Let's say this is a real number. And then automatically this gives you the whole list of items that you had in the list, which is really cool because the way it works is like, well, before we called share, I just went, iterated through all the items of my grocery, added to the list, and then just passed it as an argument here. And then I had a native sharing popping up on Android, and the same thing would work on iOS. Cool. I want to show you one more example. Well, if only one. The other example I want to show you is about the cross-platform story. So I have this project, which is pretty epic. Where is it? So I started by building in web first. And what I did is I had this service, avatar service, which basically goes to this URL API adorable IO avatars list, and then gives me a list of possible parts that allows me to assemble an avatar, right? And then I have another function that basically, if I pass in eyes and nose and mouth, it will give me a URL that will allow me to fetch a nice avatar face, right? So by doing something like this, let's see the address. Yeah, I already have it open. I'll get this, right? So you can see my designer skills is like they're absolutely epic. Let's try to load it again. Now we're getting this service. Maybe while this is loading, I can go back to the code. Let's see. Nope, loading slowly but surely. So the thing is, oh yeah, now we have the whole thing listed. So say this was probably me in the morning when it loads. Come on. We'll come back to it in a second. I'll just show you quickly the code. What I do here is basically, one, I have this service, but two, when I'm trying to then display it in the page, let's put it on the full screen. When I'm trying to display it on the page itself, in my avatar component first, I am importing the service into the project. Then basically I have like an array of strings for all the available eyes, noses, and mouths. I have a property that gives me the selected eye, nose, or mouth. And then basically when I open the page for the first time, I just basically say, okay, get me all the possible parts. And then when you get eyes and nose and mouth, just add it to those arrays. Yeah, it's pretty simple. And then basically in the UI, then later on I have like an ng4 on a button. So I'm just basically going to the list of all the available eyes and say, you know, just give me a button with the selected eyes index and then the text itself. So that's pretty much how I populated all of this. And this was me this morning before coffee. So this is how I went about building a website. So how do I go about using this and building a NativeScript application? So this is the most basic approach by the means of copy and paste, right? So I basically took my avatar service and I copied it into my NativeScript project. It's not the most sophisticated way, but it's actually one of the simplest. And then my avatar component is actually, again, exactly the same thing. The only difference is basically I'm pointing to a different HTML. So in the case of NativeScript, I would go say, well, I need a bunch of labels to display all the available eyes. Then I need a bunch of labels to display all the available noses and all the available mouths. And then finally, like you see in my webpage, I need to actually display the image and the little label underneath. So having had that code in here, I can basically go to my NativeScript project. Should run on Android? Let's run it on iOS because we can. So that should run. But the whole thing is that this whole thing is almost the same. The only difference is basically this web here, where maybe you use labels, but we use exactly the same way, the ng4. So we go into all the available eyes, and we set, we're getting each eye, setting the text, we're setting the on-tap event, we're setting classes and styling and all of that. It's like it's pretty much no-brainer. You just learn just the very small differences between the web and the mobile. But you always have to actually think the mobile way when you build those applications. And let's see if that loaded. Let's see. I probably done something wrong somewhere. I actually had it built here, so I'll just show you what I was trying to do. If the internet connects. Maybe not. Yep. So you see now all the labels popped up, and then if I change this, I pretty much should get similar functionality using the same way. And this is me after the presentation. So one very, very last thing, I'm not gonna get into the specifics of the code, but it's just the fun element, and I'm gonna close with this, is my new passion project. So if you go and Google NativeScript MIP-BLE, you can see my project, and it's as well an NPM module for working with robots. So I have this little guy here, and he's traveling with me. His name is Mipush. He's my friend. Be kind to him. Shh, quiet. So I'm gonna use the app actually built for with NativeScript. So he's got a Bluetooth interface. You see, he's very nervous. Yeah. Be kind to him. Relax, relax. We're almost there. Yeah, calm down. So I'm gonna connect to him. And he's got like different functionality, like I could use the joystick. So I have this like joystick on my thing where I could, turn around left, right, and he's super, super responsive. But he's got this even cooler thing, and I have to show him the floor because he's going crazy, where I could control him with an accelerometer, so I can turn left and right, and he goes all around. And accelerometer is yet another UI component that yet another NPM module that just works. Come on, buddy, come here. Who's your daddy? Hey. And yeah, and basically, if you would like to build an app for this guy, like just go and check my GitHub. Like there's a native MIP-BLE project, which already has a demo project that I'm just using right now. And you can go and change it, extend it, add additional functionality. And yeah, thank you for having me. And that's it. Thanks. Come here.
Hey, thank you, Sebastian.
Right, thanks a lot.
Our speaker present as well for you.
Oh, chocolates.
And
yes.
A knife.
And a knife. I only have 100.
Yeah, okay, we will send it to you.
I was sneaking in. I'm Polish. I was sneaking in, man. I'll do it. X-rays don't work on me. Oh, they try.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, after a short break, we have our next speaker in 10 minutes, Jason. So yeah, you can stay inside, and we'll go to the next talk in 5 to 10 minutes.
Cool.
Cool. Thank you.